The pre-dawn darkness of May 1st, 1898, hung like a funeral shroud over Manila Bay as 7 American warships cut through the still waters with deadly purpose. Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he peered through the gloom toward the Spanish fleet anchored near Cavite. Behind him, the USS Baltimore, USS Raleigh, USS Petrel, USS Concord, and USS Boston followed in perfect battle formation, their coal-fired engines churning. Black smoke into the tropical night sky. The tension was suffocating. 433 years since the end of the Civil War, the United States Navy had not engaged in a major fleet action. Now, with war declared against Spain just 9 days earlier, Dewey's Asiatic Squadron was about to write history in fire and steel. The Spanish Pacific Squadron, under Contralmirante Patricio Montoyo, waited ahead. Their obsolete vessels anchored in what they hoped would be a defensive position near the Cavite naval arsenal. As the American squadron approached the entrance to Manila Bay, Spanish shore batteries at El Fraile Island suddenly erupted in flame. Orange tongues of fire split the darkness as shells screamed overhead, splashing harmlessly into the water around the advancing American ships. Dewey did not flinch. His orders were clear: destroy the Spanish fleet and seize control of the Philippines. The fate of 2 empires hung in the balance as his ships pressed forward through the narrow channel. The Spanish had positioned their fleet poorly, anchoring close to shore where their mobility would be severely limited. Montoyo's flagship, the Reina Cristina, led a motley collection of aging cruisers and gunboats that had seen better days. The Spanish admiral knew his vessels were outgunned and outmaneuvered, but honor demanded he make a stand. His crews, many of them Filipino natives, pressed into service, prepared for what they sensed would be a one-sided massacre. As dawn broke over the bay, revealing the full scope of both fleets, Dewey surveyed his enemy through his binoculars. The Spanish ships looked pitifully small and antiquated compared to his modern American cruisers. His gunners had trained relentlessly for this moment, and their American-made weapons represented the cutting edge of naval technology. The stage was set for what would become one of the most decisive naval victories in history. The morning mist began to lift, and Dewey could see Spanish sailors scrambling across their decks, preparing for battle. Time seemed to slow as both fleets prepared for the coming storm. In just a few hours, the balance of power in the Pacific would shift forever. The dying Spanish Empire would suffer a blow from which it would never recover. At 5:53 in the morning, as the tropical sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Commodore Dewey turned to the captain of the USS Olympia and spoke the words that would echo through naval history: "You may fire when you are ready."
"Aye, Gridley."
Captain Charles Vernon Gridley nodded grimly and passed the order to his gun crews. Within seconds, the morning calm shattered as the Olympia's 8-inch guns roared to life, sending their deadly projectiles screaming across the water toward the Spanish fleet. The Battle of Manila Bay had begun in earnest. The American line, steaming at 8 knots in perfect formation, unleashed a devastating barrage that turned the peaceful morning into a hellscape of smoke, flame, and flying steel. The USS Baltimore-class cruiser armed with 4 8-inch guns, added her voice to the thunder, followed by the rapid-firing 6-inch guns of the USS Boston and USS Raleigh. The smaller gunboats Petrel and Concord contributed their lighter armament, creating a wall of fire that swept across the Spanish formation like the wrath of God himself. According to historical accounts documented by the United States Naval History and Heritage Command, the American gunnery proved devastatingly accurate from the opening moments of the engagement. The Spanish fleet, caught in shallow water with limited maneuverability, found themselves sitting ducks for the superior American firepower. The Reina Cristina, Montoyo's flagship, took hit after hit from the American guns, her wooden decks splintering. Under the impact of 8-inch shells that tore through her hull like paper, the Spanish return fire proved largely ineffective. Their outdated guns lacked both the range and accuracy of the American weapons, and many of their shells fell short or flew harmlessly over the American ships. When Spanish projectiles did find their mark, they often failed to penetrate the superior armor of Dewey's cruisers. The technological gap between the two fleets became apparent within the first few minutes of combat. American shells systematically dismantled the Spanish vessels while suffering virtually no damage in return. Smoke from hundreds of gun discharges began to obscure the battlefield, creating an eerie twilight in the midst of the morning sun. Through the haze, American sailors could see Spanish ships listing heavily, their masts shattered, their superstructures ablaze. The Castilla, an ancient wooden cruiser that had been converted from a merchant vessel, burst into flames as American incendiary shells found her ammunition stores. Her crew abandoned ship as the vessel became a floating inferno, as the American line completed its first pass along the Spanish formation. The devastation was already apparent. 3 Spanish vessels were sinking or severely damaged, while the American fleet remained virtually untouched. Dewey ordered his ships to turn and make another pass, determined to complete the destruction of the Spanish Pacific Squadron. The Spanish sailors, many of them barely trained and equipped with obsolete weapons, fought with desperate courage as their world literally burned around them. The second pass proved even more devastating than the first. As the American line wheeled around for another attack run, the Spanish fleet presented a scene of utter carnage. The Reina Cristina, her hull punctured by dozens of shells, began to list dangerously to port as water poured through her shattered bulkheads. Control Maranta Montoyo, wounded but still commanding from his bridge, ordered his flagship to make a desperate charge toward the American line in a last-ditch attempt to close the range and bring his lighter guns into effective action. The gallant but futile charge of the Reina Cristina became one of the most tragic episodes of the battle. As the Spanish flagship steamed directly toward the USS Olympia, every American gun that could bear opened fire on her. Tinch shells crashed through her forward superstructure, dismounting guns and killing scores of her crew. Her smokestack collapsed in a shower of sparks, and fires broke out across her deck as she struggled to close the distance. Within minutes, the brave vessel was a floating wreck, her decks littered with casualties and her engines failing. Seeing the hopeless situation, Montoyo reluctantly ordered the Reina Cristina to withdraw toward the shallows near Cavite, where he hoped to beach her before she sank completely. As his flagship limped away from the battle line, trailing smoke and listing heavily, the rest of the Spanish fleet began to disintegrate under the relentless American bombardment. The Don Juan de Austria, a small cruiser, took a direct hit, too. Her magazine exploded in a tremendous fireball that sent debris raining down across the harbor. The wooden gunboat Callao, one of the oldest vessels in the Spanish fleet, caught fire and burned fiercely as her crew abandoned ship. The Ulloa, another small gunboat, was pounded to pieces by concentrated fire from the USS Boston and USS Concord. Her thin armor plating proved useless against American shells, which tore through her hull and superstructure with devastating effect. Within an hour of the battle's commencement, half the Spanish fleet was either sinking, burning, or beached in the shallows. Spanish shore batteries at Cavite continued to fire sporadically at the American ships, but their obsolete guns posed little threat to Dewey's modern cruisers. The USS Petrel and USS Concord turned their attention to these coastal fortifications, systematically reducing them to rubble with accurate gunfire. Plumes of smoke rose from the naval arsenal as American shells found ammunition dumps and fuel storage facilities, creating secondary explosions that shook the entire harbor. As the morning progressed, it became clear that the Spanish Pacific Squadron was doomed. The surviving vessels, many of them damaged beyond repair, began to retreat toward the protection of the shore batteries or attempted to beach themselves to prevent total loss. The pride of the Spanish Navy in the Pacific was being systematically destroyed by an enemy they could barely reach with their own weapons. The technological superiority of the American fleet had turned what should have been a naval battle into a one-sided slaughter in one of the most unusual moments in naval warfare. History, Commodore Dewey suddenly ordered his ships to cease fire and withdraw to the middle of the bay. As smoke cleared from the American gun positions, revealing Spanish vessels burning and sinking throughout the harbor, Dewey made an announcement that stunned both fleets. "We'll stop for breakfast." The time was 8:30 in the morning. And the American Commodore had decided his crews needed rest and sustenance before completing the destruction of the Spanish fleet. This extraordinary pause in combat occurred for several practical reasons. American gun crews had been firing continuously for nearly 3 hours, and their weapons needed time to cool. More importantly, reports had reached Dewey suggesting that his ships were running low on ammunition, potentially serious concern given the distance from American supply bases. The Commodore wanted to conduct a thorough assessment of his fleet's condition and ammunition reserves. Before resuming the attack, as American sailors sat down to breakfast aboard their anchored vessels, they could observe the devastation they had wrought across Manila Bay. 6 Spanish ships were either sinking, burning, or beached along the Cavite shore. The water was littered with debris, and oil slicks from ruptured fuel tanks created rainbow patterns on the harbor's surface. Wounded Spanish sailors clung to pieces of wreckage or swam desperately toward shore, where their comrades attempted rescue operations under the continued threat of American guns. The ammunition count, when completed, revealed that American fears were largely unfounded. While the fleet had expended significant quantities of shells during the morning's engagement, sufficient reserves remained to complete the mission. More importantly, the damage assessment showed that Dewey's squadron had suffered remarkably light casualties. Only 7 American sailors had been wounded during the entire morning's action. Not a single American vessel had sustained serious damage. The technological and tactical superiority of the American fleet was proving even more decisive than anyone had dared hope. During this surreal breakfast break, Spanish survivors attempted to reorganize their remaining forces. Several vessels that had been beached were refloated and moved closer to the shore batteries for protection. The Spanish also used this time to evacuate wounded personnel and attempt emergency repairs on their least damaged ships. However, their situation remained hopeless. With most of their heavy weapons destroyed and their flagship out of action, they possessed no means to effectively challenge American control of the harbor. At 11:15 in the morning, having completed their meal and resupply operations, Dewey's ships weighed anchor and prepared to resume the attack. The brief respite had given American gun crews time to rest and prepare for the final phase of the battle. As the stars and stripes flew proudly from the mainmast of every American vessel, Al Huda's squadron formed up once again for what would be the decisive blow against Spanish naval power in the Pacific. The resumed American attack at 11:15 proved to be the death knell for Spanish resistance in Manila Bay. As Dewey's refreshed crews returned to their guns, the surviving Spanish vessels presented pitiful targets compared to the proud fleet that had awaited the Americans at dawn. The USS Olympia led the final assault, her 8-inch guns methodically pounding the beached Spanish ships that still showed signs of life. The Reina Cristina, Montoyo's former flagship, took additional hits that ensured her complete destruction. Spanish gunboat, Isla de Luzon, attempted one last desperate sortie from the protection of the shore batteries. But American concentration fire from multiple vessels quickly reduced her to a burning hulk. Her brave crew fought their guns until the end. But obsolete weapons proved useless against modern American armor and superior gunnery. The USS Baltimore and USS Boston combined their firepower to systematically destroy the remaining Spanish vessels, their shells creating massive explosions as they found ammunition magazines and fuel bunkers. The Marques del Duero, one of the few Spanish vessels still capable of movement, made a final attempt to escape toward Manila proper, but the USS Raleigh intercepted her with devastating effect. 8-inch shells crashed through her engine room, stopping her permanently and setting her afire. Her crew, recognizing the hopelessness of further resistance, began abandoning ship even as American guns continued to pour fire into her hull. Within minutes, she joined her sister ships as another casualty of American naval superiority. Spanish shore batteries continued sporadic fire throughout the final phase, but their resistance was rapidly crushed by concentrated bombardment from the USS Petrel and USS Concord. American shells systematically destroyed gun emplacements, ammunition stores, and support facilities at the Cavite Naval Arsenal. Massive secondary explosions rocked the harbor as fuel dumps and munitions magazines detonated, sending towering columns of smoke and flame into the tropical sky by 12:30 in the afternoon. Organized Spanish resistance had completely collapsed. Every major vessel of the Spanish Pacific Squadron had been sunk, burned, or captured. The few surviving Spanish sailors had either surrendered or fled inland, leaving the harbor completely under American control. The victory stunned observers on both sides, as an entire enemy fleet had been annihilated in less than 7 hours of actual combat, as smoke began to clear from the devastated harbor. The scope of American victory became fully apparent. The Spanish Pacific Squadron, which had controlled these waters for over 3 centuries, no longer existed as a fighting force. American casualties remained remarkably light: 8 wounded sailors and not a single fatality. Spanish losses, by contrast, were catastrophic. Over 370 dead and wounded, with their entire fleet destroyed. The Battle of Manila Bay represented one of the most one-sided naval victories in recorded history, as the guns fell silent across Manila. Bay Commodore Dewey surveyed a scene of complete triumph that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific forever. The harbor, which had awakened that morning under Spanish control, now flew the stars and stripes from every American masthead as undisputed proof of naval supremacy. Spanish resistance had been so thoroughly crushed that not a single enemy vessel remained capable of offering even token opposition to American control of the vital waterway. The immediate aftermath revealed the staggering scope of American victory. Every ship of the Spanish Pacific Squadron lay destroyed. The Reina Cristina burned to the waterline. The Castilla, a smoking hulk, the Don Juan de Austria, completely obliterated by her magazine explosion, and the smaller vessels either sunk or captured. The Cavite Naval Arsenal, Spain's primary Pacific base, lay in ruins from systematic American bombardment. Oil fires continued to burn across the water's surface, and debris from shattered Spanish vessels littered the harbor. Filipino civilians, who had watched the battle from Manila's waterfront, began to comprehend that they had witnessed the end of over 3 centuries of Spanish rule in their islands. The sound of American guns had announced not just military victory, but the dawn of a new era in Pacific geopolitics. Spanish colonial administration, already weakened by years of Filipino insurgency, now found itself completely cut off from naval support and reinforcement from the homeland. Dewey immediately dispatched boats to rescue Spanish survivors clinging to wreckage or struggling in the oil-contaminated water. Despite the ferocity of the battle, American sailors demonstrated remarkable humanity toward their defeated enemies. Pulling wounded Spaniards from the harbor and providing medical treatment aboard American vessels, this magnanimity in victory would be remembered long after the smoke of battle had cleared, establishing precedents for honorable conduct that would characterize American naval operations. The strategic implications of the victory became clear within hours of the battle's conclusion. With the Spanish Pacific Squadron eliminated, the Philippine Islands were effectively cut off from Spanish reinforcement and resupply. The 26,000 Spanish regulars and 14,000 militia scattered across the archipelago now faced an impossible situation. They were isolated, outnumbered by hostile Filipino insurgents, and confronted by a victorious American fleet that controlled the seas around them. Dewey's first dispatch to Washington, sent via underwater cable, electrified the American government in public. Manila Bay controlled, Spanish fleet destroyed, American casualties minimal. These few words announced that the United States had achieved its first major victory of the Spanish-American War and had established itself as a genuine Pacific power. The news would soon spread around the world, marking America's emergence. From continental isolation to global imperial involvement, the Battle of Manila Bay concluded not just a single day's fighting, but an entire epoch of Spanish dominance in the Pacific Ocean. As the sun set on May 1st, 1898, the strategic landscape of East Asia had been fundamentally transformed by less than 7 hours of naval combat. The United States, which had entered the day as a primarily continental power with limited overseas interests, emerged as the dominant naval force in the Western Pacific. With all the responsibilities and opportunities that such power entailed, Commodore George Dewey, who had begun the morning as a competent but relatively unknown naval officer, found himself elevated to the status of national hero overnight. His calm leadership and tactical brilliance had achieved what many military experts had considered impossible: the complete destruction of an enemy fleet with virtually no friendly casualties. The phrase "you may fire when you are ready, Gridley" entered American naval legend alongside "don't give up the ship" and "damn the torpedoes" full speed ahead as examples of decisive leadership under pressure. The immediate consequences of the victory extended far beyond military considerations. Filipino revolutionaries, who had been fighting Spanish colonial rule for years, suddenly found themselves with a powerful potential ally in their struggle for independence. However, they would soon discover that American intentions regarding Philippine sovereignty differed significantly from their own aspirations. The battle that had liberated them from Spanish control would ultimately lead to American colonial administration, setting the stage for future conflicts. For Spain, the disaster at Manila Bay represented the beginning of the end of their once mighty empire. The loss of the Pacific Squadron, combined with simultaneous defeats in the Caribbean, made clear that Spanish military power could no longer protect the nation's far-flung colonial possessions. Within months, Spain would be forced to surrender the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico to the United States, marking the final collapse of the empire that had once controlled much of the Americas and significant portions of the Pacific. Technological lessons of Manila Bay resonated throughout the world's naval establishments. The battle had demonstrated the decisive advantage of modern steel warships with rifled guns over older wooden vessels with obsolete armament. Naval architects and strategists in every major power took note of American gunnery effectiveness and the importance of superior training and equipment in modern naval warfare, most significantly for the United States. The victory opened the door to a fundamentally different role in world affairs. Control of the Philippines provided America with a strategic base for protecting its growing trade interests in China and Southeast Asia, the nation that had traditionally focused on westward continental expansion now found itself responsible for governing millions of people across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, a responsibility that would shape American foreign policy for generations to come and establish the foundation for America's emergence as a 20th century superpower.